involved in this prisoner swap, but we do know from a senior administration official that it involves multiple countries, including the United States, of course. But we can talk about who we know has been in Russian custody recently. We know that that includes a former Marine, Paul Whelan, who was imprisoned since December of 2018 on espionage charges, and his name got a lot of attention specifically in 2022 when he was notably not included in that prisoner swap that would allowed for WNBA player Brittany Griner to be freed from Russian custody. Another one that we know has been wrongfully detained in Russia, of course, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, imprisoned now for 70 weeks, sentenced earlier this month to 16 years in Russian prison for espionage charges. And when that did happen, we heard President Biden say in a statement again that he committed no crime, saying that he was targeted by the Russian government because he is a journalist and an American, and saying that the United States was pushing for his release and will continue to push for that release. And so we know these ongoing conversations have been happening for months, over a year now, to be able to get to this position today, if this is able to come to fruition. We know that there have been back-channel communications between the U.S. and Russia. That's something that White House officials, including National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, has said repeatedly when asked for any updates on this situation. Of course, he also said that there is a caveat involved, that these talks are extremely complicated and sometimes take years to come to fruition. But there has been renewed hope, especially in the wake of Russian President Putin saying in recent months that he would be willing to participate in a prisoner swap for these prisoners who have been wrongfully detained. So still awaiting confirmation that this is happening, that this has happened, that they have made it back to U.S. soil successfully. And no doubt the president, as well as the families of these people, waiting with bated breath for this good news. Jose.
And when these developments do occur, which we will live through right here live on MSNBC, we will be able to get more information about some of the details that were carried out so that this massive operation could be carried out. Now, Matt, one of the potential Americans who may be released is Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich. You're friends with him. What does this moment look like, do you think, for him and so many others as we await news about this?
Well, I think a lot, Jose, about what Evan Gershkovich must be experiencing, what he's been experiencing, and definitely if he is part of what's going on today, what that process must have been looking like. We don't specifically know where he's been held quite recently in Russia as his trial moved to Yekaterinburg, where he was arrested. The conditions were unclear, but it definitely seems as if he's largely been held alone, hasn't had very much contact, at least recently, with the outside world. So you kind of imagine a situation in which he's suddenly moved and maybe somewhere is put in a room, at some point put on another plane, with a number of other people that, as one of the main Western journalists who have been working in Russia in the past few years, are characters and stories that we've all been covering and we all know quite well, like, presumably. And so it must be an interesting experience, but we just don't know so much about what the conditions have been like for him. Obviously, this has been very difficult for his family, for a lot of his friends as well, and I think everyone throughout the entire community who know Evan Gershkovich, the former current Moscow correspondents, everyone involved in watching Russia, familiar with his work. It's been a difficult situation to watch develop. Obviously, with his sentencing last week, it's been one of these situations where if you know him, you're looking for hope in a situation that you, as a professional journalist who covers Russia, understands is largely hopeless. The Russian judicial system has one of the highest conviction rates, if not the highest in the world. It is extremely rare to get to be acquitted for any charges brought against you, and that's across the entire Russian legal system, just about 1% of cases. Now, if we look at espionage cases, the situation is, of course, significantly worse. I'm not aware of anyone getting off or dodging an espionage allegation in Russia. So it's, of course, a very difficult position to be in if you know him, if you've worked with him, because everything as a reporter is telling you that a trade might not be possible. We still don't know if it is possible, of course. And so it's just been kind of juggling that the whole time throughout this, Jose.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of Paul Whelan and his family. He's been, as we were just, hearing from Ali, I mean, he's been detained since 2018, and so very little has been heard of or about him in that time. Peter, I know that you we're all dealing with very limited details right now. There is something underway, and we have to be very cautious about what we say and what we don't say. But in a broad sense, how does this compare to past prisoner swaps you've covered?
Yeah, I think this is obviously more extensive, given what the Turks are saying about the number of prisoners involved, the number of countries involved. It looks like some sort of a bank shot. Part of the trick all along has been that the Russians were insisting on the release of a man named Vadim Krasikov, who is a Russian assassin who was convicted in Germany. And the Germans were understandably reluctant to release an assassin in exchange for, let's say, a journalist who was only arrested for doing his job. And so this has been a stumbling block all along. How do you come up with a trade that seems fair and just to the Western side, to both the Americans and the Germans and anybody else who might be involved, and still be attractive enough to Vladimir Putin to get him to release the hostages he's been holding as playing cards in effect? And I think that this has been going on obviously for months. Whatever's happening today, has been the goal for a long time. And we saw Evan's trial, which a lot of people interpreted as a way for the Russians to clear the decks, because they are never going to release anybody until that conviction takes place, because they don't want to admit that it was a wrongful detention. But here we are in July, and all of these people who have been locked up for so long have been waiting for a moment like this, if what the Turks are saying is correct.
Yeah, and I mean, just to think of that person that the Russians are so keen on getting back in Germany. I mean, on a regular day, went and shot somebody in the back of the head. And so, there are so many different pieces to this. Courtney, what can you tell us about who might have been involved in securing this deal, which clearly seems to include, to use Peter's, information, the Germans? There's so many other countries that may be involved.
Yeah, and the individual you were referring to, Jose, there, Vadim Krasikov, he is someone who has been part of negotiations for prisoner swaps that we've been hearing about for some time. He, of course, is being held by Germany. He has a long list, as you mentioned, of potential ties to the FSB, being potentially a hitman, being a criminal. And he is someone who Vladimir Putin is said to really want to be released as part of a prisoner swap. Again, we're still awaiting specific details that we can report on that. But he is one of the individuals who people are looking at as potentially, maybe part of this. Now, who would be involved in it? Because we're talking about multiple countries here, there would have been a lot of different individuals. From the U.S. government side, of course, the White House, the State Department, very involved. There's someone at the State Department who a lot of people may not know. It's the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. A gentleman named Roger Carstens runs it. I actually interviewed him just a couple of weeks ago, the day before Evan Gershkovich was put back on trial, where he was convicted and sentenced to serve in prison in Russia about 2 weeks ago. But Roger Carstens and his office, along with a number of NGOs and other members of the U.S. government, they are directly involved in these sorts of negotiations. So they will travel, they will engage with the families, they will talk to the people who are being held. Roger explained to me that he would speak to Evan and to Paul Whelan and to others who are being wrongfully detained in countries all over the world on a relatively regular basis. And they are engaged in this constant back and forth, negotiating with governments. They've also negotiated with terror groups, frankly, spoken with terror groups, trying to get Americans who've been released out of various detention situations. So they would have been most likely directly involved in this. We're waiting again for more details on that. But this is really just the beginning for these people who are returning here to the United States, Jose. They will still, if in fact they do decide to come back to the United States, however many of these these Americans are released, they can then come back to the U.S. where they will then go to a U.S. military facility where they will then go through a reintegration process, which I can explain a little bit more if our viewers are interested in that.
No, I mean, listen, you can. Let's do it.
So there's something. It's generally done at San Antonio at a place called Brooke Army Medical Center. It is where we have seen other people like Brittany Griner, when they're brought back to the United States, what we civilians might call it is like a reintegration training. What the military calls it is post-isolation situation awareness. It's where they call it PISA, of course, because it's the military, so there has to be an acronym. But they bring them back and they will go through meetings with counselors, meetings with doctors. They will talk to people about what they went through. I mean, think about it. Sometimes you have Americans who are coming back who have been held for years in dangerous, deplorable conditions. They may need very basic reintegration on things like sleeping in a bed again. You know, they may not have even been held in a room that had a bed. They may have to reacclimate themselves to things like sunlight. So it can involve weeks of this training. The families will often be brought in as well, where they will go through, you know, how they can help their loved one reacclimate to being back in the United States, being back in society. So every situation is different, but they can go through this weeks-long process. And I will say, Brooke Army Medical Center, where, you know, oftentimes people are brought back to after situations like this, it is said to be one of the best, if not the best, reacclimation or reintegration program in the world.
One of the most precious things a human can have is freedom. And I'm thinking, Richard, you know, you've been part of efforts to get hostages before. And when Courtney, you know, mentions that, you know, special presidential envoy on hostage affairs at the State Department, it just, Richard, the ever-increasing importance to rogue regimes and terrorist organizations of holding Americans hostage. How do you deal with that from a diplomatic and a governmental perspective?
With great difficulty, Jose. It's not fair, to use Peter's phrase, it's not fair or just, it's just reality. We're an open society, we travel places, so Americans are vulnerable. I'll be blunt. And regimes like Russia's, as well as others, take them for purposes such as this, where they take innocent people and they trade them for agents of their state. In this case, as is reported, quite possibly a killer and an assassin. And I think what we have to do as a country is make the difficult choices that sometimes, even if it's not fair, even if it's not even, if it's unlikes, we still have to do it because government has the responsibility to look after its citizens, after their welfare. So I think the Biden-Harris administration has made the difficult but correct choice to do this. It takes a lot of investment of time. So I mean, when Hemingway's old line about going broke, it happens slowly and then suddenly. That's how these things work. You often months or even years of painstaking negotiations, and then they suddenly come together. I'd say one other thing. You know, there's other downsides because it teaches a Putin that he can act with impunity. That he can get his people off even if they do bad things. It encourages him to take more Americans. And we shouldn't delude ourselves, Jose. This is not going to be the opening of a new wonderful chapter of U.S. relations with Russia. This is very cold, narrow transactionalism. Mr. Putin still remains as close to we have to an international outlaw as there is. So this is quite, if you will, bounded. It's a necessary thing to do. There'll be joy in certain families, anything but in those who weren't released. But this is one of the hard calls you sometimes have to make in government. And again, I think it was the right call. But again, no one should underestimate how difficult it was.
Yeah, I mean, and Alexander, really looking forward to your thoughts on this because it is a difficult situation on a normal day. I mean, this is so complicated, so many countries involved, and I'm thinking of, as Richard was saying, you know, that the Russian